Hello and welcome to my video on explaining MMT. This video I made was based on my experiences running as a candidate in the Australian election in 2019 on a MMT platform. I had many questions from people about economics. A lot of people were wanting to challenge what I was saying, and as a result I made this video to save myself from trying to explain it all to everyone all the time. I found that the existing MMT explaining videos are pitched either too high up at the economist level, or to me too basic, so they're just like they're explainers but they don't give you any sort of mathematics and stuff like that behind it. So I thought I'd put together a video with a bit of mathematics, some visual aids, some data charts and that sort of thing to help explain to people and to get them up to a level where they could challenge others that were challenging them if they started to promote this idea. I think there's several areas that modern monetary theorists, just because they're good economists, doesn't make them good communicators, and I think there's several areas of the subject that they could communicate better, so I've tried to do that this time. Again, like especially putting in some visual supports, so for the people that are sort of more visual and used to listening to lectures and stuff like that. And there's not many economists around that know this sort of stuff, maybe only about 1 in 400, I reckon. That's my estimate. So if you start looking at these sort of things that I'm talking about here, and if you start saying it out to the public, well, you have to understand that the public isn't going to be very aware, and as economists especially are unaware. You might think that they would, if this is out to the public, that they'd be well aware of this sort of stuff, but no, sadly no. This is, you're witnessing a change in the scientific paradigm happening right in front of your eyes, and it's probably going to be another decade yet before it gets well accepted, but it's just sit back and enjoy the ride and watch science changing something in real time. So I'm going to start off by having a scenario where we have some people producing goods in our economy, and they're going to trade their goods with each other. The black arrows indicate the direction of goods, and I'm going to have some green arrows to indicate the flow of money. We can see that the flow of money goes in the opposite direction to the goods, and that each person's spending is another person's income, that there is a circulation of goods in the economy, and that there's a circulation of money in the economy, and the circulation of money in the economy in our little scenario is equivalent to GDP in the larger economy. Another important thing to note, that there is 3 lots of $8, so $24 in circulation in our economy, so we've got a GDP of $24. If there was more production, say the guys were working 10 hours, then they'd produce 10 units each, and they'd want $10 each. So for all that to be, that capacity of production to be utilised, there'd need to be $30 worth of GDP in the economy. So I want to stress the importance of this relationship, that there's a general and broad relationship between the amount of production in the economy and the amount of money that you need in that economy. Similarly, we're going to look at another growth scenario. We have an extra producer this time, and if we don't provide the extra money in the economy, they're essentially going to be excluded from participating. So in order to allow our little egg producing man to participate, we're going to put another $8 into the economy, and he's going to join in the party, and there's now 4 of them. The goods are circulating all around, money circulating counter current. There's $32 in the economy, and there's 32 units of production moving around. So I'm just going to emphasize once again that there is a relationship between the productive capacity of the economy and the amount of money that needs to go circulating in it. Here we are back with our original 3 amigos. Now they're facing an extremely important question. Up till now the money's been put in by magic, but where do we get the money from in practice? So who could we have to put this money in the economy that we need? We've got 3 options that we'll start with: people, businesses, or banks. The first one we'll look at is people, and I'll explain to you why that one won't work. Imagine there's a whole heap of us individuals, and we're all trustworthily putting money in the economy. Say everyone gets $1,000 a week, and then like a Joe over the road, he's got himself a nice car and he's picked up a nice chick, and so I get a bit jealous, a bit jelly, and so I sit there and think to myself, well, I know how I could get a nice car. I'll just give myself a little bit extra money. And so I give myself a little bit extra money, and then I get myself a nice car, and then I pull a hottie, and then someone gets jealous of me, and you can see where this is going to go, can't you? And then all of a sudden everyone's cranking out tons of money, and yeah, it just clunks the whole system. What about businesses? Can we get them to do it? So a business's objective is to make a profit, and more profit is more money. So you imagine you had a whole bunch of businesses out there all happily complying with creating just the correct amount of money that society needs, and then all of a sudden one day one clever little CEO of the business, decides, I might just crank out a bit more money. We might be able to get a bit more capital, get a bit more production, and make a bit more money, and my business will go more successful. But then the business across the road thinks the same thing, and the business down the road thinks the same thing, and all of a sudden every business is cranking out the money, and this whole system's not going to work again. Perhaps we could trust the banks. Problem is, banks have the same objective as the businesses. Their mission is to make as much profit as they can, and so they're going to decay the same way the businesses did. So what do we really need here? We need a group that we're comfortable with, that's going to represent all of us, the whole of people in the economy, and then we're going to get them to be given the job of managing the money supply and the spending power that goes along with that, and being in control of it. Now, that exact thing is, well, the first part, to form the group, that's already been invented. That's what democracy is meant to do, find a group of representative agents that we're happy with, and there's sufficient numbers of support. And then the second part, find that group then manages the money and spends it and uses it and controls it to achieve the objectives of our society. Well, we already have that too. It's called government. So the government's job is not to create too much or too little money. Its job is to create as best as it can ascertain the correct amount, and not get excited like individuals or businesses will and try to produce too much of it and cause inflation and tank our economy. They're meant to be responsible with it. And the other thing they're meant to do is allocate it to things that will be maximally beneficial to our society. So here we are back with our three guys that needed their money. On the first day, they're going to sell their goods to the government. So we've got the black arrows indicating the goods going to the government. The government's going to give them money, indicated by the green arrows. The people now have their money, and now the money can circulate. Note that the government doesn't need to keep going, giving in money, putting money into the system continually. Only an amount needs to go in, and then after that, that'll just keep the system going. So next, we're going to look at what happens if workers want to do a little bit of saving. So in a diagram, you'll see that there's $2 that they want to save, and that leaves $6 each to buy the goods. But they all have sad faces because they're not able to sell their full productive capacity. This can be solved by the government once again purchasing commodities off the people in the economy. So the government purchases an additional $2 worth of goods from the workers. That puts them with their $8 able to purchase all the goods that they can produce, and they've got $2 savings, and everyone's happy. So now I'm going to switch to another diagram, and the point of this diagram is to illustrate that what we have in the economy is an amount of money circulating around, and then we can have drains on that money. As we've already discussed, injections can occur by the government spending, and what we need then is to have injections balance up with the drains. Otherwise, you're going to lose the amount of money recirculating, and if you have no change in your productive capacity, that means you're going to have unutilized capacity because you don't have the money around in the economy to purchase the goods that could be produced, and so they'll have underutilized resources. The next thing we're going to look at is how does the government go about actually doing these injections we've been talking about. So I'll start this section by introducing a cover of one of my favourite books, Everything is Obvious, asterisk, and the asterisk refers to once you know the answer. Why am I showing you the cover of this book? Well, to emphasise the opposite actually, that things that you don't have the answer to aren't necessarily easily obvious. In fact, things that aren't worked out can be anything but obvious. But what can you do when you want to make progress and you don't have the answers? You just got to have a go. And then sometimes, or even often, this is going to mean you're going to get things wrong. And this brings us to how people have tried to understand the economy over the times. We're obviously all familiar with our own personal experiences of money. So we get a job, our income, we get income from the job. We have a savings account, which is like a stock of money, which we use to write out times between income, and that allows us to spend, and we spend into the goods market. It's not unreasonable to expect then that people trying to understand the economy at the size of the national scale used a similar approach for their work. You can see how they would have approached it. They look at where does money come into us? Oh, well, taxes money comes to us. So that must be like our income. And then where does money go out and away from us? And, well, we do spending. So that would be the same as for the household. There's a big problem with this, though. It doesn't work like that. There's several points that counter that kind of concept. So the first one I'll discuss is anthropological findings. So anthropologists studying over time money in smaller societies has found that they used a system where, like they used, for instance, an example is tally sticks. So tally sticks were broken up, sticks given out to the people as currency, and then when it come to tax time, they were able to put those sticks back and match them together and prove that they had were honouring their commitments. So that's our first clue that currency is produced first and then taxes come second. Another issue is what I call the initialisation problem. So no one out there, if you assume taxes come first before you can spend, what happens if you have no money in the economy? If you've got zero money, there's no one to tax, how does the money get in the economy? So at least in the initial instance, you must have had money come in from somewhere that wasn't tax. The third issue is the someone has to make money problem, which is, we discussed that before, where the private citizens can't make the money, businesses can't make the money, banks can't make the money, so it has to be some entity that's not them. So who is it? Another thing is that the data we collect these days supports that we don't spend and tax, and I'll show you a few of those bits of data a bit later on in the presentation. People that have worked in the banking system confirm that the tax money is not used for spending, that they always just use fresh money that's created by the bank. In the US, is examples where money that's handed in as cash goes to be shredded, not used for spending. And finally, we know that, like in extreme times, when governments want to call for large amounts of money, that the processes that are required will just be followed. The Treasury and the Reserve Bank will just do what they've got to do to supply that money, and they'll worry about taxes or borrowing or whatever later on. So what we know is that the last part of our diagram, on the right hand side there, where the government spends first and then that goes to the economy, that's the actual first stage of the process. The second part from our diagram, the bit that was up the top, can actually then be tacked on to the first part to form the rest of the process, which is the economy then has tax taken out of it, which then goes to the government. Now at this point you may even ask, well, why do we even need tax then? If the government can just put money in, why does it have to have tax in there at all? Well, there's actually quite a detailed answer to that. Tax has four main purposes, but there's even more if you go into the more minor sides of it, but we'll just cover over on those four purposes now before we go on. So the first, which is nowadays ubiquitous, we don't really think of it as even being a thing, but that was to create demand for the currency in the first place. So this had relevance maybe back 100 or so years ago, when it it was a realistic thing for there to be other currencies floating around the place that you could have used. And as we go further, like from here to the future, it'll probably become pertinent again, because we've got things like cryptocurrencies around the place, and so there's actually options for you to use other currencies available to use other than your government's preferred option. So that was what the main original purpose of tax was for, is to create demand for the currency so that you started using it. A second reason for tax use is to allow non-inflationary purchase of private sector goods. So if you are the government and you want to access certain goods and you don't want to be competing with private sector dollars for it, you can tax those dollars away from the private sector and access the goods yourself without driving the price up. Another one is to disincentivize certain economic activities. So a tax on cigarettes is an example of this. The more tax you have on it, the more high price it is, and therefore the more people were pushed away from using them. The last purpose of tax is to correct for situations when we have, we had a circulating money diagram, and we had that was aligned with productive capacity. Well, if you put too much money in there for your productive capacity, you're going to have problems. So the last purpose of tax is to be able to grab that money out if you've put too much in there and avoid the economic problems associated with that. So now what we're going to do is have a look at the order of operations done correctly and how that gets done for the government to put injections of money into the economy. While we're on the subject of asterisks, I thought we'll keep going with that theme a bit. So it's not just as simple as taxing and spending. The relative changes in the amounts of spending or taxing are probably more important at absolute level for what's having an influence on the economy. So we might just examine a few combinations of what we can get there. So the first one is we have a spending increase and a taxation increase. So the spending increase will put more money into the economy, but the taxation increase is going to take more money out. The opposite is also true. A spending decrease will take money out of the economy, and a tax cut will put money into the economy. Now, what's pretty funny to me to have a look at these things in light of the Australian economy is to realise that the bottom one of the two is just an example of what the Liberal Party, or the right-wing party of Australian politics, does, and the top one is what the Labor Party, or the left-wing party of Australian politics, does. So in effect, both parties are achieving the same thing, because it's the difference between those two things is what matters. So the Liberals like to do their tax cuts, but then they also do the spending decreases, which counteracts the tax cut, whereas Labor is likely to keep taxes high or even increase them, but at the same time, they do a spending increase. So that counteracts the tax increase. Anyway, there's two more combinations to look at. So we got the one where we have a government spending increase and a tax cut at the same time. Both of those put money into the economy. And the last combination is where you have a spending decrease by the government and you have a tax increase by them also, and both of those take money out of the economy. So I'm now just going to mock up a little table of values scenario to demonstrate how this works. So I'm going to start off an economy. In year one, it's 10 units in size, and it's going to have economic growth, and it's going to grow by 1 unit each year for the next 4. And so I'm going to look at what government spending and taxing I'm going to have to do to achieve that. So on the year 2 line there, I'm going to have a government expenditure of 3, and I'm going to have tax of 2. So the difference between those is 1, and that's going to match up with my economic growth. The year 3, it looks like we've got like a Liberal government in, because they have cut the taxes from 2 down to 1, but they also cut the spending down from 3 to 2. But again, that gives us another +1 for our economic growth. Year 4, again, we're going to cut. There's still another Liberal government. We're going to cut taxes again down to nothing this time, and we're going to spend only 1 unit of money. Again, we get our +1 that we needed. And last year, we're going to put the spending back up. Looks like we've got a Labor government now. Spending is going back up, but we've also raised the taxes up to 1, but the difference is still +1, and that gets us enough money to match up with our size of our economy growing up to a size of 14. Now, when I said earlier that it's a bit more complicated, not only was I talking about the dynamic nature of the spending and taxing that you have to consider, but also there's actually more injections and drains from an economy than just the government. So we're going to consider a little four-part injection and drain model of the economy, and we're going to use that to build up a bit of a picture, more complete picture of how injections and drains can play out on the economy. So the first thing we've got to quickly understand, we'll go back over, is that when you spend more than you tax, it's known as a deficit. And we did that in all those years from our little table before. Each one was a +1 into the economy, and so they were all deficit years. They were all higher spending than taxing. So we know that deficits inject money into the economy. The opposite is true. If we got what was known as a surplus, that means that the tax exceeds the government spending in that particular year, and that will take money out of the economy. I guess I should have mentioned a little bit earlier what our other three components are for a four-component model. The other three ones, the first one's current account, which is like the trade with other countries, etc. It takes into account things other than trade as well. Like, for instance, with Australia, we have a heap of foreign students in this country, and they're paying money to us to do their university education. So current account is like trade, but takes into account all sorts of money exchanges between the countries as well. The other ones are private debt. So that's the amount of money we can get from the banks that are in an economic system. And the last part is private sector savings, which is what it obviously sounds like, the amount of savings that we have stocked up in our savings account. So with the current account, when we have what's known as a decreasing current account deficit, that puts money into our economy, and when we have an increasing deficit, it takes money out of our economy. Just trying to go a bit over the terminology here so that we know we're using the correct terminology for the correct effect it has on the economy. So with private debt, when you have increasing debt, that's what injects money into the economy, and the converse is true. Decreasing debt takes money out of the economy. With the savings, when we're decreasing our savings, it's coming out of our savings accounts and going into the economy, and when we're increasing our savings, we're taking money out of the economy. So now we're going to have a look at some practical data that matches up with this full model component that we've been looking at. So I've got a set of graphs here for you to see. There's 5 of them in total. I'll go through them from top to bottom. Now, firstly, all this data is from various Australian data collecting institutions like the Reserve Bank, the Treasury, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So if you don't like that these match up with my theory, then go and take it up with them. So the first one at the top is the current account. So we've been over this in the description of the 4-component model. So that's basically the foreign sector, and I've put that up there because it's relatively out of our control. So we'll sort of leave that at the top and forget about it largely, and we'll concentrate on the bottom 4 graphs. The next one is the one that's very much in the government's control. That's the budget balance of the government. The next one is household savings ratio. So that's the amount of savings of the private sector, which is one of the things that people tend to respond to the government's actions with, by chucking money into the economy, into that circulation, if it's been drained away by the government. The next, on that household savings ratio, one important thing to note is a thick line at the bottom at 0, because you really struggle to go below 0. So once you've got down there, you've hit a limit. So similarly on the next graph, which is the private debt to GDP as a percent, there's a limit at 150% of GDP, which has been found from studies, especially in the GFC, where countries above that limit were the ones that tended to have credit crashes. So it seems, we don't know why, but it seems that there's pretty much a practical limit to how much private debt you can have, and you can't go over 150% of GDP very much. And the final one down the bottom is the GDP growth. So that's the response of the economy to the amount of money in circulation. Right, so we're going to start with the easy stuff. So I'll start with like an easy section in this graph to understand, and then we're going to branch out either side of that and go through the other concepts so you can read it. It's a bit like looking at an x-ray. Doctor shows you the x-ray and he goes, oh, look at this very obvious thing here, and you look at it and you shake your head and you go, oh, what the hell are you talking about? But after a while you can get the hang of looking at these and understanding what's going on. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is a period from the late 80s through to late 2000s where the government run a strong surplus, and I've highlighted it with that blue panel. And the first thing to look at in response to that action by the government to run that surplus is which I've circled there so you can see easily, is the response of the private savings. You can see just as the government had a jump up in its budget into the surplus, the private savings took a massive hit. So we can represent this with our 4-component diagram. So we've got the surplus there going out to the government, so it's a drain of money on the economy, and we've got the decreasing savings, which we noted on the previous diagrams, putting money into the economy to help compensate for that. And also at the same time there was a rising amount of private debt putting money into the circulation. So I'll just put that panel back there so we can see the private debt response. So if you look at that private debt graph, the fourth one down, it in that period steadily trended up and reached that very pinnacle limit of 150% of GDP. Down the bottom with the growth graph, you can see that the economy trended along steady with maybe about 3% average growth, so it wasn't too bad through most of that period. The amount of money being put in by the private debt and the private savings decrease was able to balance out what was being taken out by the government. The next period we'll look at is the period preceding and after that period of surplus by the government, and you'll see here in both those cases the budget balance by the government was in deficit. And you can see if you look down at the savings graph, preceding the period, in the preceding period, the savings was held constant, so it was able to hold its ground. And after that drop that they had when they had the surpluses, and then they run the deficits, the savings can come back up again and recovers to a reasonable level. If you have a look on the debt graph, you can see that in both those cases, debt was higher and drops off or levels out over the period, both preceding and in the one after, it comes back away from that precipice of causing a crunch in our economy and drops down away from that 150% limit. You can see that growth down the bottom was okay in that first one of those blue bars on the left hand side, but on the right hand side you'll see that the growth drops right down, and we just managed to escape a recession thanks to the deficit spending that was done in the period after the global financial crisis. So we can represent this period with our 4-component model. The government is deficit spending, so that's putting money into the economy, and you can see the responses. The private debt was able to drop back down, so they was taking a bit of money out, but they needed to because they were getting to a scary limit. And the private sector also was able to take some money out by increasing, or its increase took the money out. So the next period we're going to look at is from the mid-80s through to the early 90s. And this blue bar this time, you'll notice if you look at the budget balance graph, the second from the top, it's going to cover not just a period of surplus, but the period preceding that where the deficit decreases over time. And you can see that that had a strong response to the private savings. I've indicated that there. So it's not just the absolute change, it can be the relative change. So even before we got into surplus, the steep decrease in the deficit led to a sharp decline in the savings rate, and also at the very end there, after we do get into surplus, we cause a recession in the early 1990s, 1991 I think it was, and also there was a bit of a jump up in the debt as well, a sharp jump up as the system tries to compensate for the money taken out by the government, but it was too late and we had that recession. So the last thing we're going to look at is the period from about 2012 through to now. So we have in that period, looking again at the budget balance, a constantly declining deficit, and we can see the response to the savings that started declining as well. We can see in the private debt chart that's crept back up and now is right on the edge again of that limit of 150% of GDP. The response of the economy, we can see with the little line I've put down there, is that's declining in the growth area, exactly what we'd expect with the money being sucked out. And that's all with a very helpful current account. I know we haven't talked about that top one, but the less the current account is, or the closer it gets to being sort of positive, the more money gets injected into the economy. So if we hadn't had that decrease by the current account, if it had stayed constant, we probably would be just on the edge of a recession right now. We can show this occurrence again with our 4-component model. So I'll put the current account in this time, so it has a decreasing deficit, so that's putting money in the economy, But once again, the government, by decreasing the deficit and trying to get a surplus, is pulling money out. So that's requiring, or the natural reaction of that is for savings to drop down, the decreasing savings to help put money in the economy to try and, that's just a natural response that the economy try and ask for. And similar with private debt, the businesses go looking for money from alternative sources. When it's not coming in from the market, they go out and get their debt, and that's heading back to its maximum limit once again. The Australian system is relatively complicated, so I thought I'd go out and get you an illustration of deficits and surplus from the US, and then use that illustration. I'll mark on the recessions and use that to show you the response of the US economy to high deficits, low deficits and surpluses, and illustrate what goes on with the economic growth in response to that. So I've taken that diagram and I marked it up with green bars up the top when there's recessions. If there's a little sort of L shape on the bottom, that means that those years that that bottom bar covers was also in recession. I've marked deficit decreases with black lines and deficit increases with orange lines. Now there's a red line in the middle, and that's because that's actually where modern monetary economics doesn't apply prior to that line, due to it not having a free-floating exchange rate. So then I'll just cut out that diagram to the left of that and just keep the right section. So we've got a bigger and clearer look. So now we can see almost frequently, like the best one to look at is the one in the 1990s. The deficit steps down, 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 and then just right at the start of the 2000s there's a surplus, and bang, straight after that there's a recession. Now I've put orange question marks right where you have like the maximum deficit, and you'll see each time the deficit has a maximum, there is no recession at that point or just after it. Whereas almost every time with the decreasing deficit, which according to mainstream economics should be the best time in our economy, that's when we have our recessions. So how can it be that according to mainstream, just as things should be the best, we have recessions, and when things are at their worst, when we have the maximum amount of deficits, we don't have recessions? That's because it's incorrect. It's like I said from the start, the way they think about it with tax first and then spend is incorrect. It's spend first, then tax. And so deficits are an indication of the amount of money you're putting into your economy, and if you drag that money out, then you're taking out that money from that circulation thing that I've been talking about, and then that starves your economy of like being able to use its productive capacity. And well, the obvious response to that is things like rising unemployment, decreasing demand, shutting down businesses, and recessions. So up to this point, we know we have it within the government's power to put money in the economy, and I've stressed that it should be done in balance with the productive capacity. But how much is that, and how do we go about doing it? That's the subject of the next section. So I use a concept I call the maximum spending footprint, and you can see on the slide there, I've got just a black outline box to indicate the area of the maximum spending footprint of the economy. I've put a blue line in, and everything below that is the private sector spending footprint. And since the private sector usually is about triple the size of the public sector in Australia, I've put a green line on top of the blue line to illustrate the public sector's or government spending footprint. So the difference between the sum of the private and public sector spending footprint and the maximum spending footprint is illustrated by that red arrow there. That's unutilized capacity in the economy. So I've just tried to put a couple of figures on the size of those footprints. So Australia's total GDP is about 1,200 billion, and if the private sector is 3/4 of the size of our GDP, then that amounts to about 900 billion. So these are just rough figures. I'm sure some people will contest these ones that I'm using here. Now the next thing I've done, and this is a lot more of an estimate than any science, is that I've just tried to like give an indicative size of the amount of unused capacity in our economy, and so I've said that's about 200 billion, and therefore like our maximum spending footprint would be 1,400 billion. Now this is a very simplified account of things, and it gets a bit more complicated than that. And something I want to emphasize is not just the amount of money that you put in that's important, but where that money is going. So an economy is made up of many sectors, and I've got an example here where I've got 5 little hypothetical sectors in my economy, and not all of those would at any time be at the same amount of utilisation. So in my example sectors here, I've got labour, and the green line that's in that column indicates where the utilisation's at. So labour is quite unutilised. It's via unemployment and underemployment and lack of participation, and so we might only have about 75% utilisation in that sector. Whereas if you look at the construction sector next to it, that one's highly utilised. That might be up to about 95% utilisation. And I've just put in manufacturing, agriculture and mining as 3 other example sectors. So now we're going to have a look at what would happen if we took our 200 billion and split it up into 5 even parts, 40 billion each, and put that evenly into each of the sectors. So you can see there I've made some red squares to represent our $40 billion, and I've put it on top of the utilisation bar for each of those sectors. You can see in some cases that the 40 billion has stretched the utilisation for that sector outside of the maximum spending footprint, so we know that inflation is going to occur there. So here I've shown a way we can take our $200 billion and put that into the economy without having any inflation. So it involves that you put more money into the more underutilised sectors. It's also worth noting that in the case of labour utilisation, you don't just need the spending, but you also need a set of regulations around the job guarantee to ensure you don't get inflation in that sector, and I'll talk about that in a little while. Another thing to note is that the economy isn't just a static thing. Even if we assume a fixed maximum spending footprint so that we have no economic growth, the initial insertion of this amount of money into the economy will cause the private sector to expand, so then we'll need to reduce the amount of money being injected over time to avoid inflation in the future. So I still haven't spoken about how we work out the actual maximum spending footprint size, and that's the topic of the next section. So I've made up a couple of stylized graphs to illustrate the relationship between inflation and productive capacity utilisation. I've got another one on labour utilisation versus inflation, which we'll get to in a sec, but we'll just have a look at this one. So this could be for an example of the steel industry in Australia. So you can see that along the x-axis you've got the amount of production capacity being sold. So on the left hand side of the graph it's the low end, so there's a mark there of 70% of the production capacity of the Australian steel industry being sold. Up onto the right hand side there it's kind of continues linear until 95%. These are just indicative figures. I in no way purport that this is an accurate research figure. It's just to show the nature of the shape of the curve. On the y-axis we have inflation, and I've just put there 0% intersects with a 70% of capacity being sold. Below that you'll get price deflation in your steel. Up to 95% you're getting about 2% inflation per annum, and then after that the relationship changes from being linear to starting to be steeply rising, and for a few more other percentage increments there in this amount being sold, you can see it rises rapidly up to 4, 6 and 8% and ever more rapidly. Similarly, here's another graph for the labour force, showing basically the same sort of thing, except for you'll notice that the 0% inflation intersects with 95% on my stylized graph here. I've also got a version of this graph showing it in the form of unemployment rather than percentage employed. So here's a look at it with the unemployed. So you see above 5% unemployment you'll have wage deflation, and my stylized graph at 3% unemployment you'll have 2% wage growth, and so on and so forth. It rises rapidly the less unemployed there are as businesses compete for workers. And in our economy there's any number of sectors, each with their own little relationship of this sort of nature with utilisation, productive utilisation and inflation, and that will sum together to give us one for the overall economy. And so we should target some level of inflation there. I've kind of indicated about 4%, but I think anywhere between 3 and even 8% isn't unreasonable. I think there's on record that Brazil was able to have an economy that was unharmed by inflation running as much as 10% per annum. Above that might be, some other economists say that you could go to 40%, but I'm not an advocate for anything like that. I'm an advocate for around 3 to 5 with an amount of calmness if we were up to say 6 to 7. But the question is, how do we still calculate where that's at for the entire economy? Well, at any instant in time, that's a very difficult thing to calculate. probably too complicated to calculate, but there's ways we can get around it. The simple and obvious way is to use a feedback system, much like is used with interest rates today, where you monitor your economy. If your economic growth is too high, then you raise interest rates. If your economic growth is too low, then you cut interest rates. And so we could just do a similar thing, but with inflation. If your inflation is too low, the government can be comfortable spending some more. If there's too much utilisation of the productive capacity, the inflation will rise and the government should stabilise its spending, or if it has to, take money out of the economy. Now, I've spoken like there's only one sort of method to drag money out of the economy, but I use the concept of one big blunt instrument versus lots of little sharp instruments to explain how modern monetary economists view how we can control inflation by taking or regulating the way money goes in the system. So, and now it contrasts nicely with the neoliberal economists' approach to inflation, growth, and everything. They just use their interest rates and think that controls everything. But in the case of the modern monetary economists, inflation control is very important to them. So they've got a shopping list of approaches that they believe you could take to manage where inflation is going to go or keep it below the limits that will cause problems with the economy. So they use regulatory approaches, which forces spending to particular areas. They've advocated selling bonds to drain money from the economy, which I'll talk about a bit later in a section on bonds and interest rates. The taxes, also in many different forms, are a way to control where the money goes or drag money out. As well, with the modern information gathering departments that most developed economies have, with the Bureau of Statistics and the like, they are able to, we're not flying blind, we have plenty of information coming in on where utilisation might be getting tight, and we can react to that. We can implement non-inflational spending programs. The job guarantee, which I'll talk about in a while, is an example of that, but you could have a public housing example as well, where you have fixed prices and controlled prices over time to stop them being inflational. And of course, there's then the reducing or delaying of spending from the government to reduce any effects. Another important thing to note at this point, and it's counter to what the media, a lot of politicians and mainstream economists would have you believe, and that's that the economy is not delicate. Now, mainstream media tries to advocate that it is delicate, we've got to get everything just right, or we're going to have all sorts of problems. But I've been watching the Australian economy for some period of time, even the US and the UK, the New Zealand economy. And in the case of Australia, the UK and New Zealand, we've been hammering their economies, and amazingly, the little economies are just hanging in there and hanging in there. I can't believe how well they're able to take the hammering and not go into recession. I've been watching over the past year, I guess, in just amazement that we haven't got there yet. So two things come from that. Inflation isn't likely to turn up out of nowhere and surprise everyone and cause a big recession that we couldn't see coming. And secondly, even if inflation got above a target band, it is not likely to run away, and it won't hurt for it to sit above the target for some time either. So the moral of this story is that economies are resilient and unlikely to surprise us if you know what to look for in them as to causes of recessions. So we've come to the end of the first and main section on how the productive system and money system work and need to be managed. I've got sort of several parts that I'm going to cover from here, partly to provide more complete explanation on modern monetary economics, and partly to answer questions that I typically get that I haven't covered yet. So just the parts quickly are a section on debt, a part on the job guarantee. I'm going to do a section on interest rates, bonds, and since that's what the mainstream economics focuses on, why they focus on that and what that means. A section on productivity and how that relates to modern monetary economics, and also why the economy switched in the 1970s from modern monetary-like economics to the economics we have today. So the first section we're going to talk about is debt, public government debt, and what that means. So we're going to bring back our little table that we had before of explaining deficits, and we're going to expand on that a bit. So we're going to add to our original table 3 more rows, years 6, 7, and 8, and we're going to do a few more combinations of deficits and surpluses in there. I've added in 2 columns on the right hand side, 1 column to explicitize whether we have a deficit or a surplus, and the other column tallies up the deficits and or surpluses and shows us how much debt we have. So just running quickly down through the deficit column, you see for the first 5 years from our first example, we had a deficit of 1 each of those years. In year 6, we spend and tax the same, and so we have a balanced budget. It's neither a deficit nor a surplus. In year 7, we're doing 0 government spending, but we're taxing 1, which means we get a surplus in that year. And in year 8, we're spending 3, taxing 1 to give us a deficit of 2. On the next slide, we're going to tally up what the government spent over the years. So I'll put another row down the bottom, a total row. So over the years 2 to 8, it spent 12, and same thing in the tax column, total up the 2 to 8 taxing, it's 7. And if we look over, I'm not going to put a total in the debt row because the debt is a running tally of where we're at, and 12 take 7 is 5. Debt is simply the sum of the money that's been put into the economy by the government which hasn't been taxed out yet. Debt is money left in the system for us to use. It shouldn't be called debt. It's a stupid name for it that's left over from, it's a hangover when we thought the country's economy operated like a household. If we had no so-called debt, we'd have no money in circulation to use up our productive capacity. This makes sense when you think about how many countries have so-called debt and how much of it there is. The US has debt. Some say that the US has its debt to China, but China has debt. Some say that has its debt to the West. But all the Western countries have debt, like the UK, France, Germany, Australia, Canada. Japan has debt. Some people wonder if we don't all owe this money, because you've got to wonder if everyone has debt, who holds that debt? Shouldn't someone be up if everyone's down? So some people wonder if we don't owe the money to a private group, and even the largest estimates of the largest fortune of the Rothschilds is still only not even 10% of the amount of the world's debt. So well, where's the other 90%? Who do we owe that to? Simply put, no one, because there is no debt. It's just the money that we have in the economy. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the job guarantee. Remember this picture from earlier where we're talking about labour utilisation and having the spending power to fill up the labour market? Well, there's a few other tricks you have to use and things you've got to put in place to allow that to exist. So we're going to talk about them. Or first, we're going to have a look at the problem of the existing setup. So in order to do this, I've made a little illustration of people and businesses, and we've got some unemployed people down the bottom outside the businesses. We've got employed people in little spots, roles inside their businesses, and we've got some gaps up the top where we have vacancies that the businesses need to fill to have everyone in their roles. So on the next slide, we'll see the businesses have filled those vacancies up, but we still have some unemployed people out the front. And in that situation where you've still got some unemployed people and the businesses are running full though, then you've got still some competition for employment, and so there isn't likely to be any wage inflation pressure. Let's say the economy goes really well though, and the businesses want to grow and more positions open up. So we've added some more spots down the bottom, more holes in our business for people to fill, and then unemployed people fill up those spots. But the companies still have some unfilled positions remaining as well, so they want to fill them up. So then the company on the right decides to get smart, and it's going to up its pay to try and make those positions more attractive. So that then takes a couple of people from the first business, they go over to fill the spots in the second one. There we go, we've got that illustrated. But then the first business gets smart and goes, I'm going to add even more money than you're offering to try and fill my spots. And then this kind of builds a arms race of money offering to help the businesses fulfill their their productive capacity by having everyone in the roles that the business needs. This can go on for a while, but eventually it leads to an issue where the profits drop off, and then the businesses have to lay people off to return to profitability to keep themselves sustained. And that leads us right back where we started from. So the only way you can stop this wage inflation issue when you have very low unemployment is to regulate the wages in some way. So an example could be that you'd limit the pay increases over time that employees can demand, and also as well, it's not just pay increases for an employed person that leads to wage inflation, but when people change jobs like we just saw in the previous examples, they can be attracted by a jump up in pay to swap jobs, and if you have enough of that, that will drive wage inflation across the whole economy. So, but this kind of defeats the purpose of having a free market in wages, doesn't it? So if you have the current free market wages system, I must emphasise that it is impossible to get full employment with that setup. It does not matter how educated your workforce is, it doesn't matter how motivated they are, you can't get full employment, because if you do, you're going to force it to be back to unemployment because of the wage inflation. So I'll explain that a bit more to make it clear. Under the current system, you will always have an amount of people as a population for whom getting a job is impossible. If some people get that job, some jobs, then somewhere else in the system, other people have to fall off to keep the wages under control. So remember that no matter how much you might have politicians out there talking as though they're trying to get everyone into the workforce, whether by genuine attempts to help out and support, or by force and disciplinary sort of measures, it will be impossible. Now, this is not the view of mainstream economics itself. They delude themselves that this problem doesn't exist. They have invented concepts such as full employment being when you got 4.5% unemployment. They call it the natural rate of unemployment, or the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And they conveniently forget to tell politicians about this. So when the politicians are out there bashing the long-term unemployed as bludgers, you don't have the economists saying, "Oh, whoops, yeah, we designed a system and you can't get them. They can't get employment. It's just impossible." But then that's the mainstream, not modern monetary economists. Modern monetary economics gets around this free market wages versus full employment conundrum in a, I think, pretty sensible way. So it says, let's leave the people at the top to have their wages still determined by the market. But for those people at the bottom that are basically not in demand by the private sector, the unemployed people, we'll supply them with work, and we'll come up with systems to supply them with work, and we'll do it at a rate equal to the minimum wage, and we'll have a ceiling on the amount of hours that those people that are in that system can work. And between the ceiling amount of hours and the fixed price for the wages, it does not matter how full the employment goes. There can't be wage competition because the wages are fixed, and you can't drive overall inflation in the economy because the people can't work or more than a set amount of hours in the system. Because you can see how if everyone in the system decided to start trying to work 80 hours or 100 hours or 120 hours in a week, and then that could be a way of driving up the cost of the program. But if you've got a ceiling amount of hours, then you're limiting the total amount of cost of the scheme, and therefore you can keep it safely away from causing any inflation in the economy. And this gives us the best of both worlds. An economy where you've got full employment, but we have freedom for people to be good workers and be rewarded for their efforts and skills at their work. So I've come to the end of the job guarantee section, but before I go, I just want to spend a bit of time talking about how I'd configure the scheme, because often people have a fair bit of misgivings about how the scheme might be set up. So the first important point to note is that it's set up local, so that people can, from their existing living place, get work close by, rather than you're not asking the population to travel or rearrange itself all over the country to go and get work. The jobs occur in their local communities. It's administered locally, so the funds will be supplied from the federal government down to state governments, out to local governments, to locally administered job guarantee centres. This system's not intended in any way to be punitive. People's participation is voluntary. They can come onto the program, adjust their program while they're on it, hours up or down, and go off it as they please without any effect on anything else the government provides them. The scheme is meant to be supplied with work requests by local people, local bodies, government bodies, etc. The types of work submissions, there's some that will not be accepted. So the participants in the job guarantee scheme aren't meant to be substitute workers for private sector businesses, nor are they even meant to substitute for existing public sector jobs. So the sort of work we anticipate that they'd be getting submitted is environmental repair and monitoring work, aesthetic improvements in the local communities, like fixing up sort of rundown facilities, and even just landscaping and that sort of thing. Caring work is a big one. They could be the manning of large recycling, reuse, repurpose and waste prevention centres. Community improvement work, so not just maintaining things as they are or were, but developing brand new things in the community. these sort of things. The people that are eligible, everyone above a minimum age is likely to be eligible, and in Australia that probably be 15 years. So that even includes old people, even retired people. The applicants do not have to work 40 hours per week. That's just a ceiling. They can nominate the amount of hours from 1 hour per week up to 40. People are also able to nominate preferred times that they would like to do the work. If you've already got a job, you can participate in the scheme. So if you have work that's sort of in the private sector part time, in say hospitality, your work is on the weekends, but you have free time during the week. Well, then you can nominate to do a weekday work on the job guarantee scheme. And again, you can fill up your hours up to a maximum of 40 per week. The aim of the program is to sensibly match people's skills, their physical abilities, and their time constraints with the jobs or the work that's submitted into the job guarantee administrators. So the job guarantee administrators receive a heap of requests, and they try to match up as best they can people with the work. So an older person shouldn't be given a physically demanding job. That would go to a younger person. The program participants are subject to all the conditions and benefits of normal employee full employment, so sick leave, annual leave, superannuation, etc. One last question people kind of ask me about the job guarantee is that the work you're doing is non-profitable, so how can that be like useful or sustained? And as I've shown that we don't, the system of the economy has an amount of money spare to be used for these sorts of things. So we are sensible in doing this sort of thing, and there's various examples where things that aren't profitable are still useful for our society, such as the education system and the health system, in that I'll cover this a bit later, but the productivity that we put out as an economy determines how much spending we can put into it. So doing a thing like this where you have people increasing their skills, it'll keep them healthy, it'll keep them in better physical condition. These sort of things increases the productivity of your overall workforce, which increases the amount of money to be spent that you could spend if you chose by the government, because it manages that money system. So hopefully through this job guarantee section, I've shown that the current system can't supply the society with full employment, but that we have the spending power and the know-how to set up a system which could do it, and that will bring many benefits for us as a whole. The next part I want to talk about is interest rates, bonds, and why there is so much focus on that from the mainstream economists. So mainstream economists see interest rates as vitally important. If you want growth, then all you do is you cut your interest rate and the rest will sort itself out. Modern monetary economists do not share this belief, though. They think that interest rates only make small and short-lived changes, and if you're having a lull in your economy, that's not caused by real productivity-related issues, then it's likely that the lull would have been caused by your own lack of deficits in the previous time period. Now, the reason I'm including this section is that when I've been talking to people and they know a bit about the economy, they'll know that like I claim that the government doesn't need taxes to spend and can just spend money, and they don't need to borrow, then what are bonds? They ask me, aren't bonds the way the government borrows and it gets its money off of citizens now by promising to give them the same back later with a bit of interest on top? So selling bonds are mostly about controlling interest rates. So to illustrate this, I've got a diagram up on the top left there. We've got the interbank lending rate, which is the target interest rate that they talk about. We'll just make that 1%, doesn't really matter what it is. And then below that, we've got a reserve ratio that we'll aim for of 10%. So then we've got a circle representing the economy. Inside the economy, we've got Bank 1 and Bank 2. On the left-hand side, there's Bank 1. It has $120 of loans, and 10% of $120 is $12 of reserves. So we've satisfied our reserve ratio of 10% there. Over on the right, we've got Bank 2. That's got $80 of loans and $8 of reserve. So that's following the rules, keeping everything happy. And down the bottom, we've got the Reserve Bank of Australia. It's going to play a bit of a part in this little story. So in this first scenario, we're aiming to maintain our interest rates at the target, and we're just going to use bank to bank, or what's going to happen is bank to bank, they'll sort it out themselves. So the next day, we have a new scenario with Bank 1 and Bank 2. Bank 1 has $100 of loans and $12 of reserves, so that's got excess of reserves. And Bank 2 has $100 of loans and $8 of reserves, so that's got a deficit of reserves. so they can sort this out pretty easily between themselves. What happens is Bank 1 supplies $2 of reserves at the target interest rate, the interbank lending rate, across to Bank 2, and they end up with everyone happy because they've got the correct amount of reserves for the amount of loans they have on their books. So when those banks can loan to each other like that at the target rate, that just keeps everything nice and happy and at the 1% target rate. What we're going to look at in scenario 2 is how interest rates get stopped from rising. So in this scenario, we've got both banks have $120 of loans on their books now and only $10 of reserves each. So we're short $4 of reserves. So the banks say, well, no worries, Reserve Bank and Government of Australia, we can get you some more reserves that you require us to have. I'll just start, like each bank just thinks I'll offer another bank a higher interest rate, and that way I'll get some reserves off of them. But this is not what the government wants. They want the interest rate where they've set it, because once the interbank rate starts changing, it will change all the other rates, like home loan rates and that sort of stuff in the banking system, and that will mess things up according to the mainstream economists. So what happens then is that the Reserve Bank will supply the banks with the reserves, so in this case $2 each, and they'll supply it at 1%, and you can kind of get the idea why the Reserve Bank is called the Reserve Bank now. They supply those reserves and the banks meet their requirements and the interest rate stays where the government wants it. So in this next scenario now, we're going to look at how to stop the interest rates from falling. So what happens in this scenario is you've got an excess amount of money that's floating around in the economy and it's looking to be stored in a nice secure place. So the excess money is always looking for a return, and this money counts as reserves. So what the excess money says to the banks then says to B1 in this case, oh, well, we'll give you $12 and we'll charge you 0.9% interest for that. That's better than the 0% we're currently getting. And Bank 1 said, oh, that's a sweet deal, because these $12 of reserves I've currently got has 1% interest charge. So then they think, well, how to offload that $12? Well, I might sell it to Bank 2 at 0.95% interest, and Bank 2's like, yeah, that's sweet, because we'll save on the $12 we've got, and so on and so forth. And what happens is that the excess money starts to drive down the interest rate, which is not what the mainstream economists or the government want, because, as I've said, they believe interest rate levels are very important. So what the government does then is it puts a little suction thingy out into the economy and says, oh, well, we'll give you 2% if you buy our bonds. And so what happens then is the excess money gets sucked up by the bond selling process of the government, and you can see a little illustration there. Excess money has been like vacuumed up, and we're just left with like plain old money in the economy there at the end. The government retracts its little sucker back in, and everything is happy once again. So that's the reason why bonds get sold, is to help maintain in the existing system to control the interest rates. But as I said earlier, we can also use bonds to control inflation as well, by like sucking out money that would have been used for spending and competing if a area of sector of the economy was already tight, and you had that spending money in there, then that can drive inflation. But bonds are just one extra way that we can have to help drag money out of the economy and control inflation. Anyway, that's enough on bonds. Let's get back to some interesting stuff. So remember this diagram from earlier on where we had the unutilized capacity in the economy. So a question becomes, what are we going to do with that unutilized spending power? Now, we've already discussed the job guarantee, and that's the most important thing that we should do with it. But there's still other unused capacity and spending power beyond the labour sector. So what should we do with those? Now, to me, that divides into two broad areas. One is solve society's problems, and can anyone think of any problems society has at the moment that might need some spending to solve? Like, for instance, climate change and renewables. We've got a lot of renewables to build, and even if you don't believe in climate change, well, we're getting depleted in oil and gas, and by getting depleted, I mean we've still got a few decades to go, but it'll also take a few decades to build the amount of renewables we need to sort of substitute for those. So there's no shortage of things to do there. So that's part one. Solve society's problems is what we could use that unutilized spending capacity to do. The other part, which we're going to talk about now, is for productivity increase. And if we go down that path, that becomes like a bit of a virtuous circle, in that with more productive capacity and more productivity, you then get more of that unutilized capacity in your economy and have more spending power available to you. So I've got a little circular diagram to illustrate this. So it starts off with like more productive, and then that means more spending power is available, and then the more spending of power available means you can improve conditions for society, and then that can lead you to being more productive, and I'm going to expand on how that happens now. So what things lead to society as a whole being more productive? Well, there's a whole range of them. So better environment. Now you might wonder how that can contribute, but if you have like a better ecological system, it's able to produce more crops, if nothing else. But then ideally you want to look after the whole environment as well. Better health. So if you have someone that's sick all the time, they're not going to be the best worker, but if they're in good health and they're fit, then they're motivated to do work. Same with education. Someone that's uneducated, imagine someone that can't even read or write, they have a hard time participating in an economy where you need to use machinery. But once they've got their education and are a good learner and that sort of thing, they can branch off to do all sorts of things. Better infrastructure, that's been like over history in the last, especially in the last sort of 50 to 70 years. Better roads, better rail, nowadays better communication services like internet and that sort of thing leads to better productivity. Similarly with better services. So a simple example of a better service might just be the motor registration department being able to allow you to do your registration renewals via the internet, so you don't have to drive down there and use up time doing that. And of course everybody working in a job guarantee being usefully contributing to our society gets people motivated. So then all these things add up to allow us to have more spending power available, more government spending power. And so then what could we do with that government spending power? Well, of course, we could spend it on those sort of things again. Spend it on the environment, spend it on health, education, infrastructure, services, and a job guarantee. And what's that going to do? That's going to, well, it improves conditions for society, but then that improved condition for society with healthier, happier, more educated people, more able to contribute to the productivity of the economy, that's going to make the economy more productive again. And around we go in a circle. And these are the sort of things that Australia and the US and the UK did after the war from 1950 to 1970. We did a lot of those. We established public health systems, improved our services, fixed up infrastructure and that sort of thing, and spent on education and improved that. And that's why we had such a good running economy in that period of time, because we were improving our productive capacity of our economy. Speaking of the 1970s, the next thing I want to, or the last thing I want to talk about before we wrap up, is to cover why we switched away from the economics of the preceding period to that which we have now. There's a golden rule in economics, which is that a theory of economics remains until it can't solve problems in the economy. And what happened in the 1970s is they had a phenomenon known as stagflation, which you had a stagnant, which is a non-growing economy, and you simultaneously had high inflation, which was a combination that was previously thought impossible. So at the time, the cause that was thought to be that there was a lack of market liberalisation causing problems. So at the time you had like unions, they were demanding higher wages, and you had like protectionism and tariffs, and that was allowing like slack, uninnovative private sectors, and you had the public sector taking over large parts of what things that had previously been done by the private sector. So the solution that was dreamed up at the time was liberalise markets and systems and via deregulation, etc., and it all sort itself out. Hindsight has allowed us to review those ideas, and we know now that there was a strong amount of inflation was driven by the oil price rises, the oil price shocks at the time in the 1970s, one in 1973 and one in 1978, I think it was. And at the same time, you had the unions were really strong in that period, and they'd been driving wages and conditions for workers, and that had been improving the lot of workers and of the economy as a whole for some period of time. But in this period, it made the returns to the capital down to unsustainable levels, which dropped growth. And at the same time, though, there was the high prices from the oil, because energy is so ubiquitous, it goes into everything, and oil, like the products from oil, go into everything. It's not just it ends up as plastics, it ends up as fertilizer, that sort of thing. So it went throughout the economy, and the two phenomena put together drove up inflation. So what we should have done, had we known what we know now, is that we should have put controls in place on oil and energy use, price controls, and even rationed the amounts of oil that was available and the products from it. And at the same time, the unions should have calmed down on their wage demands. They should have been willing to accept even wage reductions, and the same, they should have been willing to accept hours reductions evenly over the whole economy and whole workforce, rather than what happened was that some people kept their hours and others just got fully unemployed as a result. And this would have allowed profitability to return to the businesses. And I'm not talking like gluttonous, massive profits for these businesses. I'm just talking about getting them back to the bare minimum where they can sustain themselves and improve their productivity, or even keep their productivity even and keep the economy tracking along as it was. I guess it's worth mentioning an even better thing than having people in the economy share the burden of reduced sort of hours would be to have a job guarantee sitting there as well to like help out in times of lows in the business cycle, where if the private sector wants to offload people, they can, and those people just get absorbed up into the job guarantee sector, and they go and do other things more community orientated and stuff like that, and keep up their skills, so that in times when the private sector picks back up again, those people are right and ready to go for work. Okay, so it's time to wrap up. So the first thing I want to do is just run over a quick summary of some of the contradictions between modern monetary economics and mainstream, and they'll allow us to highlight things that you can look for yourself to fact check what the mainstream economics is claiming. So the first one mainstream economics claims is that public debt exists and it's bad. Well, I want to know then, how bad do you have to get before you go bad? Because, for instance, Australia's debt to GDP is about 40%, and the US, for instance, is at 100%, and Japan is at 240%. So Australia should at least be able to get to where Japan is before we have problems. But then someone tell me, when does Japan run into problems? When they're at 241% or 242% or 300% or 360%? When does public debt become a problem? Can you tell me that? Next one is deficits are bad, surpluses are good. So in Australia at the moment, we're getting very close to getting a surplus, and the closer we get to having a surplus, the worse our economy, the closer it comes to having a recession. So keep an eye out for that. The mainstream also claim that money comes from banks and that interest rates control the economy and government spending does not. Well, it's good that the Australian government is providing a good test bed for this at the moment. So normally when you have recessions and stuff like that, they both cut rates at the same time as the government ups spending. But our government, the current government, seems really resistant to doing any spending. So we're already starting to cut interest rates. So what should happen is we're going to get a really good, clean look at the effect of interest rates over a period of time, and I'm expecting that's not going to make very much difference at all. And then the economy will stay going bad and bad, and then eventually, I don't know, it might take another government to be elected before we get the spending coming in, but then once the spending comes in, it should pick up. Another one you can look at is the best unemployment levels you can get are around 4 and 4.5%, which is true in their paradigm. You'll be lucky to find Australia get below that level of unemployment, but as soon as a country somewhere out there in the world implements a job guarantee, you should be able to see them achieve 2% or less unemployment. So let's do this wash up then. So politicians and economists have a poor understanding of how the economy works. In summary, they think the national economy is like a household. This does not tally at all with what the data shows, like why do things go bad when we get or go towards a surplus, and when this is precisely when things should be at their best according to the mainstream and to the politicians. Instead, the national economy needs money in proportion to its productive capacity, and it's the government's job to supply the money to do this. It is complicated to determine the amount of money that can be put in before it causes inflation, but we can instead use a simple feedback system like we currently do with the interest rate system. The problem with the economy that we've been told, that we've been led to trying to run it according to this household narrative, is that as a result we don't have the recirculating load of money in the economy using up the capacity as it should, and the economy is lackluster as a result. Since we've run the economy so far away from where it needs to be, this means that as soon as we choose to start running it properly, there's currently a big gap. There's a lot of unused capacity, and so as soon as we want to start doing it properly, we've got a lot of spending power available up front to start to fix up the issues we want to address. If you look at like inflation over time, you can see that the grey band is the Reserve Bank's target, and you can see this is just an indication that we are under capacity, because you can see inflation is dropping, and we're nowhere near even their minimum target. And the low inflation levels we have now become even more obvious on a longer time scale. You can see on this other graph that goes back further in time how high inflation has been historically compared to now. Now we know the reasons of the 1970s ones, but even back into the 1980s you can see that the inflation was relatively high and the world didn't end. Australia was still able to continue on. The period from the 1950s to 1970s is interesting. So in that period we ran consistent deficits for maybe about 30 years on end, from about 1955 through to about 1985, and yet in that period before the oil price rises occurred and the wage demands were too strong, that we had sensible levels of inflation. So it shows that it can be done. Again, if you have a look at that picture of the deficits we've got up there, you can see, well, over the whole time, 4 out of 5 years has been a deficit year. There's not much surplus years in there, and you can see that. And what you got to remember is that, like I've said, a deficit is an injection of money into the economy. Which, if you have the productive capacity that's increasing at the same time, growth in the economy, then you need that injection. It's not a debt we're running up to be paid off. It's just an injection of money that's needed by the system. You can see, if you contrast the pre-1985 period to the post-1985 period, you'll see of late we've tried to get a lot more. It's a lot more of a surplusy period, and it's not surprising then that in that same period we've had like the private savings running down, we've had private debt running up, we've had low inflation, and not surprisingly a pretty subdued economy over all that time. So using the stupid, flawed terminology that we currently use, which takes the household narrative, is that the government should run whatever deficit it takes to achieve society's objectives as best it can, whilst being watchful of the inflation rate. At the very minimum, with additional spending possible, the government should be able to set up a job guarantee. There are also many other positions that we take that logically follow from the old view of economics, and I'll give just 2 examples. If there's no debt, and it's not possible for there even to be debt, then we don't have to worry about burdening future generations with debt repayments, freeing us up to be a lot more relaxed with spending for solving problems. The second one is that in light of a job guarantee where everyone has a job, many things which get hotly debated in election run-ups and that sort of stuff, and this is what happened in our electorate, they become of secondary importance because a lot of those debates are over what is the best way to get jobs. So in my electorate, we had a debate over an oil company who wants to come and drill in a very pristine and valuable natural environment, and we also had another one where the Australian as a country as a whole is looking for somewhere to put its low-level radioactive waste, and some towns in my electorate have nominated themselves to be potential sites for that, and then you have had big arguments within the community as to the sensibility of that, and it's strongly divided in communities. But in the case where you have a job guarantee, all these things become discretional. You can choose whether your community represents a good spot to the waste dump, because not for jobs, but because maybe your area has the suitable geology for being a safe dump, and also actually having the dump would help stop the waste being strewn all over the place and in somewhat poor quality dumps and uncontrolled to one well-regulated, well-set-up single facility. Similarly, the requirement for perpetual economic and population growth becomes optional for us. So I haven't kind of touched on that too much, but modern monetary economics doesn't actually require growth as a given. It can you can have a steady state or even a contracting economy, and our contracting economy doesn't necessarily mean you go backwards. Because on a per capita basis, if you had the population shrinking faster than your economy shrinking, you will still be going better off on a per person basis. And even when I was talking about the productivity increases, those productivity increases don't necessarily have to be manifested as increases in consumption. Far from it. They can be set up as efforts to reduce waste and increase recycling, those sort of things. We could expand like research institutions and try and progress rather than consume. Now that you've seen this video, there's a responsibility on you to understand this. You can challenge it if you like, but don't ignore it. If you could do something to stop people from being excluded from having a job and contributing to society via unemployment, is it not like there an onus upon you to see if you can deliver that? And not necessarily you as a person, but to see if voters can deliver that for those people? Should you spread that knowledge or this knowledge to others so that they have a chance to contribute to solving this problem of our economy? If you found a practical way that we could start solving climate change, would you be a good citizen to just sweep that under the carpet, or even just be apathetic and ignore it? What sort of people and what sort of society would just leave all this in the too hard or I don't give a basket?